that tracking is a tool, not a test. You don't need 100% adherence for results. Consistency comes before targets, an inconsistency that's holding you back from reaching your goals. Tracking can be time consuming and it can feel like really high effort for very little reward if you don't have the right mental and practical approach. Welcome to episode 2 of The Unfiltered Athlete, the show where we get real and honest about training, nutrition, performance, and mindset. I'm Georgia Radley, nutritionist, athlete, coach, and now the host of The Unfiltered Athlete podcast. I'm here to help you fuel smarter, train harder, and actually enjoy the process. Join me as I share practical advice, science-backed strategies, and all the things I learned and got wrong along my journey from starting in the gym as a complete beginner to competing internationally in 2 different sports. Today, I wanted to get stuck into a topic that I hear people struggling with all the time, and it's actually such a big one that this is going to be a 2-parter, so I can break it down into the mindset side of things as well as the practical side of things. And this topic is tracking macros, but specifically tracking macros without losing your mind. Because whether you're thinking about giving tracking a go but feel overwhelmed at the thought, or maybe you've tried it before but struggled to stick with it, or maybe you are already tracking your food but you're just wishing there was a way to do it that doesn't feel like a full-time job, tracking can be time consuming, it can be frustrating, and it can feel like a really high effort for very little reward if you don't have the right mental and practical approach. So in the first part of this 2-parter, I'm going to cover how to master your mindset towards tracking, because this is what's going to set you up to actually be able to implement the practical tips that I'll share in part 2 effectively. So we're not racing ahead here. The mindset part is like building the foundation. You need to do this for it to be worthwhile to lay the metaphorical bricks, aka the practical tips that I'm sharing in the next episode. So first up, before we even dive into the mindset tips, I did just want to briefly clarify what exactly I'm talking about when I say tracking or tracking macros, just in case you're new to me or to the idea of tracking in general, or even just to make sure we're on the same page. In this episode specifically, I'm referring to tracking your food intake using an app such as MyFitnessPal, NutriCheck, Chronometer, MacroFactor, or one of many others, where you track exactly what foods you're eating, how much you're eating, and then the app helps you track the nutritional content of those foods, in particular the calories and macronutrients, or macros for short. And if you're not sure what macros are, I've linked to 2 blog posts and a free guide that I have in the show notes below, as well as my ultimate guide to tracking with MyFitnessPal, which you could check out if that's new to you too. But in short, we are talking about protein, carbohydrates, and fats. And there are other methods of tracking your food intake, like a written food journal or a photo food log, but we're focusing right now on tracking macros because it's this method that gives you the most clear, accurate picture of what you're eating and in what amounts in a completely objective way. And on this note, I just want to touch a little bit more on the benefits of tracking in case you're fairly new to it, but also because understanding these benefits underpins some of the mindset pillars I'm going to be covering later on in this episode. So one of the things I talk about a lot is that tracking gives you numbers, it gives you data. It's not subjective, it's not opinion, it's not, I think I eat pretty well, it's clear and it's factual, which means you can work logically and strategically with it. And this might sound intimidating or maybe boring on the surface, but I promise it will all make sense as to why this is actually a good thing as this episode goes on. The first reason being that it's actually far more simple when you have the data, when you have those objective numbers, than trying to use guesswork or even various fad diets, which can involve quite elaborate food rules actually and restrictions to reach your goals. So having the numbers, when you do it correctly, it does not make it more complicated, it actually simplifies things. And following on from this idea of tracking giving you data, a lot of people think tracking is all about hitting targets from the get-go, like hitting specific calorie or macro targets. But first and foremost, it's this incredible tool that not only provides data, but can help you build awareness and knowledge along the way. Because as you're tracking, you can start actually learning what's in your food. So you're no longer being misled by packaging that tells you something is high in protein when actually it's only got 5 grams, or assuming something is nutritious because the marketing team have nailed the packaging design to make it look like it's some incredible health food. So you can start paying attention as you're tracking to the data that you're collecting. And when I say that, I'm talking about the data from the tracking itself, like the numbers you're getting in MyFitnessPal, for example, but also all the other information that you're getting directly from your body, like what makes you feel energized, or how is your training feeling right now, or your recovery, is your body weight or body composition changing? And when you pay attention to all of these things, you start to get some really valuable insights into things like your eating patterns, maybe your appetite, what foods affect your appetite, cravings, etc. And all of this just starts to build this level of independence and ownership over your nutrition that traditional diets or just sort of generic nutrition advice simply doesn't teach. So as an example, if we think of our standard diet, take your pick from like a 10-week little black dress diet from a magazine, or the 5-2 diet, or a juice cleanse, etc., etc. They don't teach you actual nutrition understanding. Sure, there might be some book that goes with it full of, at best, cherry-picked scientific studies that completely exaggerate the results to fit whatever they're pushing, or more likely just complete pseudoscience and anecdotal evidence to back up that diet. But you're not actually learning lifelong skills, and you're not learning any of the fundamental principles of nutrition that are actually the driving force behind whether any diet works or not. Because if these diets do ever work, it's not through magic, it's through these basic principles of nutrition that tracking will actually teach you. And so through tracking, rather than just blindly following a rigid set of rules that you can't stray from, you instead start to get a clear picture of your current nutrient intake. And that's just from tracking without even trying to hit targets. And you can then use these numbers to make improvements and start working towards your goals with intention and clarity, not guesswork, not cutting out foods or hoping that the next diet you hop on will be the answer, because I can promise you it won't be. And on that note, it's so important that we are on the same page in that we are looking at tracking not as another diet, but we're looking at it as a skill and a tool that you can use to achieve nutrition, health, and performance goals. But like any tool, it needs to be used correctly and appropriately, and it can even be damaging if it's misused. And this is really why I want to cover mindset in the first part of this 2-part episode, because it's the mindset and the habits that we build around tracking that make or break whether it becomes a tool that is helpful or harmful. So what do I mean by harmful? Well, when tracking macros goes wrong, when the tool isn't used correctly or approached with the right mindset, we can end up, well, losing our mind with it, hence the title of the episode. And I know this might sound a bit dramatic, but I've had plenty of people use those exact words to express to me just how frustrated and fed up with tracking they were getting. So let's just touch on what that can actually look like, and then I'm going to teach you how to avoid each of these scenarios. And I want you to let me know, shoot me a DM on Instagram or drop a comment if you're watching on YouTube, which of these is you, because I know I've been every single one of them at some point or another. So the first scenario here is the overwhelmed tracker. And this is the person who downloads the tracking app and expects it to kind of be super easy straight off the bat. And when it's not, they feel completely overwhelmed, like it's too hard, like how am I ever supposed to remember to track everything, and how will I ever know how to track this food or that food, let alone ever be able to hit specific targets. So they're expecting immediate overnight results, and then they feel frustrated and overwhelmed when that doesn't happen, like it's too hard, and they give it a few days and give up. And this is honestly so understandable, and it's so common, and ends up with people thinking like tracking just isn't for me, or even that tracking doesn't work. But the key to avoiding this scenario is, of course, mastering your mindset, which we'll come on to very shortly. So that's the overwhelmed tracker. The next scenario is the obsessive one. And this is the perfectionist, the person who has seemingly nailed tracking on the surface in that they're hitting their targets seemingly with ease. But the problem is that if they don't hit their targets, they completely fall apart. Maybe it's anxiety and stress indicating that they've built an unhealthy relationship with tracking and like needing to control everything. Or maybe it's more like as soon as they don't track, they maybe massively overeat because tracking has, again, been used as a tool for control, and not tracking almost feels like a rebellion of sorts. Or maybe when they don't track, they undereat because they are fearful of overeating. So that's a few different ways that the obsessive tracker can fall completely off if they don't track. So we're not looking at tracking being this really rigid framework that if you stray from it, everything falls apart. So that's an indication that something isn't quite right. And then another way that this obsessive tracking can manifest that you want to look out for is if you're making major changes to your lifestyle that you don't want to make. And I'm not talking about positive lifestyle changes like cooking more homemade meals. I'm talking about things like turning down social events, avoiding things that you actually really want to do because tracking and hitting targets has taken over your life. And this can happen so easily if you don't approach tracking with the right mentality and can be really damaging short term and long term. Right? So that is the obsessive tracker. And then the final scenario, maybe the most common sort of middle ground between these two, is the inconsistent tracker. This is the person who only tracks when it's easy and practical and then avoids it when it's not. Or when they know that tracking will mean that they don't hit their targets. So say you go for a meal out and you could track it as an estimate for the sake of having some complete data, but you avoid it because you don't want to see your intake being above or below your targets. Or it might be a case of tracking in the week but not at the weekend, or say tracking for 2 weeks and then trailing off, and it's just whatever sort of pattern it falls into, it's a very inconsistent pattern. And it can be a practical issue in terms of you fall off when you're busy, or it could be mindset based, like you won't track if you've been off targets, or if you have a day off you really struggle returning to the habit. And I want to specify that this inconsistency is different from deliberately taking breaks from tracking or deliberately introducing more flexibility with tracking, which is something that I absolutely encourage. So much so that I've dedicated an entire section of the Athlete Nutrition Blueprint to teaching you exactly how to start introducing flexibility and introducing tracking breaks. But the inconsistency I'm talking about here is an inconsistency that's holding you back from reaching your goals. And as I said, this can stem from practical and psychological places. So we'll tackle the mindset first in this episode, but the next part of how to track macros without losing your mind is also going to be so helpful for this, because I'll be giving you practical tips that are also going to make it just so much easier. So we have these three scenarios: overwhelmed, obsessive, and inconsistent. And as I said, I've certainly experienced all of them at some point or another, and you might see bits of yourself in each scenario rather than just relating to one. But yes, there is a solution. There is another scenario, and that's where we actually find a middle ground: the intentional, consistent, and imperfect tracker. And that is the person whose tracking is underpinned by these 5 key mindset pillars. Mindset pillar number 1 is that tracking is a tool, not a test. This one is the first, most essential thing we need to understand when it comes to using tracking to actually be helpful. That tracking is all about data, not judgment. You're not doing it right or wrong. You're not like good or bad at tracking. There's no should when it comes to, I should be hitting these macro targets every day, for example. And especially if you're just getting started, this is going to completely shift your long-term relationship with tracking, because most of us start off with some big preconceived notions of what we should be doing, or like expecting ourselves to be perfect robots who just really easily eat consistently and hit our targets perfectly every day. And it's much harder to shake that mindset and that expectation further down the line. And specifically when I talk about tracking being a way to collect data, this means we want to avoid avoidance. So remember that inconsistent tracker I just mentioned, who doesn't track when they've had a meal that they know is going to put them over their targets, or doesn't get back to tracking when they've had a day off because they feel like they've messed it up. This is an example of not seeing tracking as data, because if we do look at tracking as this really helpful tool for gathering information on our bodies, then we can see that tracking that situation anyway, even if it would mean that we were off targets or quote imperfect, means that we will still have all this complete and helpful information. And this idea also ties into that obsessive tracking scenario, right? We want to loosen our grip on tracking being solely about constantly hitting numbers perfectly, or even being unable to have days off tracking, because once again, it is not a test. And this mindset is also going to help you avoid the overwhelmed tracker scenario, because you don't need to feel overwhelmed by tracking if you let yourself take it one step at a time and give yourself the patience and time to learn how to use the tool effectively. I'm probably going to butcher this analogy, but let's say if you were a craftsperson or a tradesperson and you had some fancy new tool that had the potential to allow you to produce amazing things, but it was a tool that would require a lot of practice and skill to be able to use well to create those things. You wouldn't expect to just be able to pick it up and create these perfect outputs straight away, you would expect to need to take some time to hone that skill at using the tool. And it's the same with tracking. So again, mindset pillar number 1, tracking is not a test, it's a tool. It's about collecting a whole lot of data and information that is going to be helpful for you. Mindset pillar number 2 is that tracking consistency needs to come before targets. Following on from tracking being about data, there's no point in setting targets if you don't even know your baseline. And I've included this as a mindset pillar rather than a practical one because it's about setting realistic expectations and priorities. Like, I'd rather you track 7 days a week, not hitting or even aiming for any specific targets, but developing a clear picture of what you're actually eating and your habits, rather than track 3 days where you nail some arbitrary targets that maybe you've pulled from a generic calculator, but you have no record of what you've eaten on the other 4 days. Because overall, this just isn't giving you a clear picture of your intake, so we then can't use it to adjust, improve, and set targets that are actually based on what you and your body needs. And to put this into perspective, to give another analogy, imagine getting a running program or a strength training program with specified distances and paces for running, or weights and reps for strength, but it hasn't been based off your current, say, 5K time or 1 rep max. So what you've got is a program that is so arbitrary, like these numbers have been plucked from thin air, or maybe just completely estimated, and then you're going to feel like you failed if you weren't able to hit the program sessions. A bit like if you set out trying to hit calorie and macro targets without knowing your current intake, you're far more likely to struggle to hit the targets and to feel crap doing so. And then you feel discouraged, you think you failed, and you think, this just isn't for me, etc. So here is what we do instead. We start off with a phase where the only goal is to track consistently. And this is actually phase 1 of my signature nutrition program, the Athlete Nutrition Blueprint. Even if you've tracked before, it's the first step, because what we're doing here is we're removing judgment. We're removing the idea of failing completely, because there aren't specific targets to hit. And the idea is that we are just getting consistent with the habit of tracking. And the effects of this are amazing, because firstly, that habit of tracking gets strengthened so that when you do set targets, you're used to tracking already. So this reduces the overwhelm that I've already talked about. But you also have this incredible bank of data that's based on your body, not a calculator, not an estimate, not ChatGPT's bullshit recommendation, but actually what you're currently eating. And when you track your weight alongside this, you'll find out whether you're at maintenance, aka your current calorie intake is the amount that is required to maintain your weight, or in a deficit if you've lost weight over that period of time, or in a surplus if you've gained weight over that period of time. And this then lays the foundation for you to set targets that you can actually hit and that actually work. And I've included this here rather than in part 2 on the practical side of things, because remember, this episode is about tracking without losing your mind. And one of the best ways to get frustrated and hate tracking, give up, get overwhelmed, is to be chasing targets that feel impossible and/or that aren't even working. So to recap mindset pillar number 2, you're prioritizing consistency before even thinking about hitting specific targets. And from a psychological standpoint, this is taking away so much overwhelm, reducing the risk of developing this obsessive mindset or an all or nothing mindset, but it's also setting you up for success from a practical standpoint, so you can set targets that are actually based on your body. And this brings me very nicely onto the third mindset pillar, which is setting realistic and relevant targets. So the easiest way to get the basics covered with this one is following the process I just outlined for making sure your targets are based on your data, not a generic calculation. Because by definition, if you start with your baseline, it's much more realistic to be able to make specific intentional changes from there. It's realistic maybe to go from eating 100 grams of protein per day to eating 110 grams per day, but it might feel pretty unrealistic to suddenly increase from 100 grams to 170 grams per day, which brings me on to another way you are going to make sure you're setting realistic targets, which is to focus more on the improvements than the end goal. And there's a variety of ways that you might do this, but let's use protein as an example I've already used. Let's say you do want to build your protein intake from 100 grams per day to 170 grams per day. Why not start out with the aim of getting consistent with 110 grams per day? Then once you've ticked that goal, nudge it up again to 120 grams, etc. So you're building momentum, you're acknowledging successes and improvements along the way, rather than feeling defeated by a target that just feels really, really out of reach. Because these consistent improvements will be a hell of a lot more effective than trying to hit 170 grams, maybe managing it a couple of times, but being way off on most days and just giving up and feeling frustrated, again, feeling like you failed when you haven't. And when it comes to these targets too, another important thing is to know your priorities. Calories are your first priority. That's your total calorie intake. Then you want to prioritize calories and protein. And only then might you consider also looking at carbs and fats specifically, and maybe later down the line, even looking at nutrient timing. So things like when you're eating carbs in relation to your workouts, for example. But we're not going to skip to the top of the pyramid of nutrition priorities with things like nutrient timing when we haven't understood and built a strong foundation, that strong base of the pyramid of consistent calorie and protein intake. And I think when you worry too much about those smaller details, especially earlier on, you are much more likely to get overwhelmed and frustrated, and it also dilutes your focus, which needs to be on the basics. A final little tip too, when it comes to making targets realistic, is using ranges. So using, say, 2,000 calories a day as a target, fine, but it doesn't need to be as precise as this. We can zoom out and look at your average intake across the week. So why not try a range of 50 to 100 calories either side of this? Because that gives you a little bit more flexibility and you can feel a sense of achievement when you're within this range, rather than only feeling that sense of achievement when you're like within a few calories of that one target, or feeling like you've messed up when you were maybe 50 calories over target when you just don't need to be because it's such a small amount. So there were quite a few mini tips crammed into that one. So let's recap. Mindset pillar number 3 is to set realistic and relevant targets. And to do that, you're going to A, focus on making gradual, intentional improvements from your baseline rather than setting targets that feel unattainable. B, you're going to prioritize exactly what targets you're focusing on, with calories and protein being the most important. And C, you are going to use a range rather than one single number as a target. And all of these will mean you're putting your focus in the right place to be able to make consistent, measurable progress, which builds momentum and keeps you out of the all or nothing or overwhelm traps. Let's get into mindset pillar number 4. You don't need 100% adherence for results. And this might seem a little counterintuitive when I've been banging on about consistency before targets, so hear me out. I'm talking about 100% adherence. So adherence would be the percentage of time you're hitting your targets, for example. And you could start out by tracking adherence to number of days you track, or adherence to protein targets or calorie targets. It doesn't have to be like adherence to all of your targets or none of them. You can measure adherence to different parts of your tracking, and that's also a helpful tool depending on whether you're an absolute beginner or you are an athlete who's really trying to maximize and fine-tune things. But the point I'm getting to here is that you don't need to hit your targets every single day to get results. The type of consistency we're looking for isn't 100% adherence for a few days or weeks or months. It's 70, 80, 90% over a long time period. It's to be consistent enough to get the kind of results you're looking for. So let me use a client example. Someone I was working with who initially was really struggling with weight loss, even after we'd set appropriate targets that were realistic and relevant based on her baseline. And it was because she was stuck in this all or nothing mindset. So if she tracked, say, 5 days a week, she'd still beat herself up and call it a bad week, even if there was progress within those 5 days, in terms of maybe she was hitting her targets more often, or her training might have gone really well, or even like the scale had gone down, which was her goal at the time. But because she was expecting and thinking that she needed like this 100% adherence to be successful, then she'd feel like she'd messed up and she wouldn't be able to celebrate that progress along the way. And this would often lead to self-sabotage, overeating on those non-track days, or just heading into the following week feeling like she'd never be able to, quote, like get it right. And it took some time, but the real change came when she started to see that actually she was making progress, even on those weeks that were like 70% successful as she might have considered it. So rather than focusing on trying to make all her weeks 100% weeks, she just needed to keep going and reduce the number of weeks that were 50% weeks, or the weeks that had previously really derailed her progress and her mentality towards the process. We just needed to bring them that little bit closer up to that, 70% mark, rather than trying to make every week a 100% week. And one of the ways I help to do this, so we would specifically say, right, last week you hit your calorie targets 4 days out of 7. This coming week, let's aim for 5 days. And there were occasionally 7 out of 7 weeks, but I'd say the majority were 5 to 6 days out of 7. And then the days that maybe weren't tracked or weren't on target became like less significantly off track than they once were. So there was less guilt, there was less binging, less like, fuck it, I'll get get back to it tomorrow, so I'm going to go all out today. And she built so much more confidence in her ability to stick with it, to be consistent, to not need to be perfect, and to trust the process, as cheesy as it sounds. But like, your confidence in your ability to just get back to it is so important. And this was the point that the weight really started to drop, because we got to this level of consistency that wasn't 100% adherence to the targets, but it was a level of consistency that was enough for her to achieve the specific results that she was trying to achieve. And she was also much better able to maintain it at the end of the deficit, because she hadn't been relying on this like unsustainable perfection to be able to achieve those results. So for you to put this into practice, let's say you'd rate your current nutrition as a 0 out of 10, just for argument's sake, and you're currently aiming for a 10 out of 10, but actually, why not start aiming for a 5 out of 10? And you will probably be able to hit that target, and you might even surpass it some days. And then as you start to get consistent with this sort of 5 out of 10 level, you feel good about it, and then you start to shift the goalpost towards hitting a sort of a 7 out of 10 or an 8 out of 10, etc. And you probably don't need to get to 10 out of 10, whatever that hypothetically looks like, to reach your goals. And as a general rule of thumb, the more extreme your goals are, the tighter, the stricter, the more adherence you'll need to have. Like, stepping on a stage as a bodybuilder requires a serious level of consistency, discipline, and adherence. But this is actually to the point that it's widely accepted and known that it's really not healthy anyway. So when you're thinking about this fourth mindset pillar, it's about establishing a level of consistency and adherence that works for you and that you can keep up. Because if you're not able to be consistent 70% of the time, why are you expecting yourself to be consistent 100% of the time? You want to start at a realistic point, work up, and build gradually. And now for the fifth and final mindset pillar you need to be able to track without losing your mind. How you handle going off track impacts your results more than going off track itself. Let me explain this with an example. Let's say you went out for a meal, and even without tracking, you went way over your targets. It happens. Breathe. But what I see happening more often is that this single event turns into a full-on spiral. And it's that spiral that actually does affect your results. Whereas if you just drawn a line in the sand after that meal out, moved on, continued as normal, not tried to compensate, eat less, over-exercise, and also not gone, fuck it, and decided not to track the next day as well, or overeat the next day, and then again, avoid another day of tracking, etc. If you had just moved on, that one meal out would have had such a minimal impact on your results long term, like so minimal. And if you don't believe me, because we've all seen the scale go up by several pounds after a big meal out and probably panicked over it, let's put it into numbers. Let's think logically about this. So if your goal is to be in a calorie deficit and you're aiming to eat 2,000 calories per day, your maintenance is 2,500 calories. So that's the amount you would need to eat to maintain your weight. 2,000 calories per day is the amount you need to eat to be losing about a pound per week. So that means you're in a 500 calorie deficit each day, or a 3,500 calorie deficit in total across the week. Now, if you overeat on your meal out by 500 calories, you're literally just at maintenance for that day. Not even at maintenance for the week as a whole, just that day. You've still been in a deficit for 6 out of 7 days of the week. So that would be if you went over your 2,000 calorie target, which is a 500 calorie deficit daily, by 500. So you ate 2,500 calories on the day that you had your meal out. And that would, as I said, just put you at maintenance for that day. No big deal. So let's say you ate 1,000 calories over that 2,000 calorie target. So you ate a total of 3,000 calories that day. You are literally still in a deficit over the week. It's just going to be a slightly smaller deficit, so your weight loss you can expect to be a bit slower that week. And I could go on, but even if you ate 3,500 calories over your target that day, so a total of 5,500 calories when you had that meal out, you would literally still be at maintenance for that week, provided those other 6 days you stuck to your target. That is literally how hard it would be, how much you'd have to eat to push out of a deficit if you've been consistent for the other 6 days of the week. But suddenly it can be very easy for 1,000 calories over target on one day to then seep into the next day, especially if you see the scale go up and you panic that you've gained loads of weight and you think, well, there's no point, like I've ruined it now, when actually that weight is just water retention. And then this negative spiral kicks in so that by the end of the following week, you may well have actually gained weight, as in gained fat mass, because you let that one off-track meal turn into an entire week. So the key takeaway here is that you will go off track. Not just meals out, but in your day-to-day for like a multitude of reasons. But how you respond to it is what's going to have the biggest impact on your long-term results. Remember mindset pillar number 4. You don't need to be 100% adherent. You just need to be consistent over time. So next time you do overeat or drink alcohol when you'd not planned to, or whatever going off track looks like for you, instead of beating yourself up and catastrophizing, you're going to breathe. You're going to be logical, and you're going to remind yourself that how you respond now is what's really going to make a difference. And then you're going to continue at the next meal or the next day as normal, without guilt and without trying to compensate. And that concludes mindset pillar number 5. So let's quickly recap all 5 of those mindset pillars that are going to set you up to be able to track your food without losing your mind. Number 1, tracking is a tool, not a test. It's not about being perfect. It's not about good or bad, passing or failing. It's about continuously gathering data about you and your body that you can use to fuel your body to feel its best. Number 2, consistency comes before targets. Build the habit of tracking first, because if you can't be consistent with tracking itself, you're not going to be able to stay consistent with hitting specific targets. Number 3, when it comes to these targets, they need to be relevant and they need to be realistic. Use your starting point so that your targets are relevant to you and your goals. Focus on small, gradual changes and work with number ranges too, so that you're setting yourself up to actually be able to hit these targets and feel good and motivated about it along the way. Number 4, you don't need 100% adherence. We're looking for imperfect consistency over time, not being 100% on some days and 0% on others, and expecting to nail your targets every single day with robotic precision just makes it more likely that you're going to give up or resent the process, rather than recognize what you are doing well and be able to enjoy life at the same time. And then finally, number 5, how you respond to a bad day matters more than the bad day itself. It's rarely an untracked meal or social event that actually derails progress. It's usually the aftermath, the mentality that you've messed it up, that leads to a spiral of self-sabotage. The best thing you can do is to move on. No compensation, just eat your next meal as normal and take the temporary weight fluctuations in your stride, because it's all part of the process. And then there is one final mindset reframe or metaphor that I like to use to bring all this together. And that is that tracking is a dimmer switch, not an on or off light. So we want to move away from the all or nothing approach, move away from perfection, like expecting to hit your targets 100% every day, never having off days, never missing a day of tracking, never struggling with it, and moving towards turning the dimmer to a point that works for you in this season of your life. And if you're a beginner, then you might start with that dimmer turned further down and then turn it up as you go. Or if you're more advanced, or maybe you lean more towards the obsessive tracker that I talked about at the start, your challenge might be to practice turning the dimmer down every now and then, taking a day or a week or even more potentially away from tracking, or actually allowing yourself a bit more flexibility with your targets when it makes sense to. Maybe you're an athlete and it's your off season, or you've been in a deficit and you've done a reverse diet and now you're at maintenance. Building the skill of being able to turn that dimmer switch up or down is what is going to make tracking sustainable, rather than something you revolve your entire life around. If this episode helped you reframe your approach to tracking, or even just took a little pressure off, I would love to hear from you. Which of these tips, which of these insights hit the hardest, and which element of tracking has been your biggest struggle up to this point? I want you to drop a comment if you are watching on YouTube, or shoot me a DM on socials, or send me an email. I'll link it all down in the show notes. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. It really helps grow the show and reach more people who need to hear this. And also make sure you tune in for part 2 of this double episode, where I'm going to cover more of the practical elements of tracking without losing your mind. I'm going to talk about the day-to-day methods, hacks, and routines that are going to make it easier, less stressful, and less time consuming to track your food, because it doesn't need to feel like this massive chore if you know how to make it as easy as possible for yourself. I'm also going to be sending out a poll, because I want to hear from you as to what future episodes you want to be hearing next. I've got a load of ideas, but I want to know what you want to hear the most. I will be putting that on my Instagram stories and in my emails, so make sure you keep an eye out for that. And then the following episode I am very excited about. I'm continuing on this theme of tracking, and I'm diving into exactly how much you should actually be eating and showing you exactly how I figure this out for myself and for my clients. And if you're looking for a step-by-step system that takes all the guesswork out of eating for your goals, whether you want to get stronger, fitter, faster, leaner, or build muscle. The Athlete Nutrition Blueprint is for you. With 4 key phases taking you through everything from setting those initial targets using the method I talked about earlier in this episode, to following those targets, to adjusting them for your goals, and even mastering meal timing to take your performance and body composition to the next level. And unlike most nutrition programs, it is a one-time payment. It is not an ongoing subscription, although if you want to split the cost, I have included a super affordable payment plan option too, and you can find all the details in the show notes. Finally, if you are not sure where to even start with your goals, whether it's your nutrition, your training, your mindset, or something else that's holding you back, I've got a free 2-minute quiz called the Train Assessment, designed to take you from painful plateaus to peak performance. And again, you can find all the details right below in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining me in this episode of the Unfiltered Athlete podcast. See you in the next episode.